Welcome to the Renal Research Institute's Frontiers in Kidney Medicine and Biology, where we share knowledge and advances in kidney research with the world. In this episode, we will discuss pervasive sensing, privacy, and patient care, a glimpse into the future. Our guest is Dr. Fokko Wieringa, who is Principal Scientist with the Connected Health Solutions Department of IMEC in the Netherlands and Associate Professor of Medical Technology in Utrecht. Dr. Wieringa has over 30 years of experience in the med tech field. He has published extensively on technical topics in medicine. He co-authored several international safety standards and the European Union Directive on Optical Radiation Safety. He is also a core driver of the Dutch Kidney Foundation's NeoKidney initiative to develop a portable artificial kidney. It's my great pleasure to talk today to Dr. Fokko Wieringa, who is actually an expert in wearable devices, pervasive sensing. He has researched this area for decades, and he is an associate professor at the University in Utrecht and principal scientist with the Connected Health Solutions Department in Netherlands. Now, we will talk about pervasive sensing, privacy, and patient care, and a glimpse into the future. So, Fokko, really, it's a great pleasure to welcome you, and we will chat a little bit about pervasive sensing. Now, an obvious question is, what is pervasive sensing? Is there actually a sort of a definition that you can offer to our audience?
Well, it's a relatively new concept, and in fact, in 2000, David Nagel from George Washington University in DC wrote the first technical paper on it. And well, he defined it as quite wide definition: the widespread and possibly dense deployment and the continuous either latent or real-time employment of diverse sensors networked to systems or people for the gathering of information of practical use of mere interest. Now, that's easy to repeat, of course. You will know this by heart when I said it once. But it's a broad definition, but we're coming back to that. Now, if we look upon history, 6 years later, the RAND Corporation, and that was their National Security Research Division, which is important in this context, they published a report with some technological predictions up to, say, 2020. And they defined pervasive sensing in this security context as the presence of sensors in the most public areas and the ability to network sensor data to accomplish real-time surveillance. So one could sense some similarity with the prediction of George Orwell's 1984, although Big Brother was not mentioned, but this was on the security context. Then, if we go to 2015, Deanna Johnson from the automation firm Emerson defined pervasive sensing as the use of sensors to capture data on anything in a plant as an industrial installation that could affect its operation. Okay, so now what is pervasive sensing in our context, in health context? Well, replace plant by person and operation by health. So you would end up with the use of sensors to capture data on anything on or around a person that could affect its health. And that is probably doing the trick for us today.
Okay, now this is very interesting. So thank you also for providing this historical perspective. Now, let me think about a few examples. I mean, we have Apple Watches, we have built-in sensors like with defibrillators. Would all this fall under pervasive sensing?
Actually, I think it does. This is sensing itself, of course, but pervasive would mean that it's couplable. It can be networked. Basically, pervasive sensing could also be said the Internet of Things that can sense, used in our case, pervasive sensing for healthcare, it would be used then for healthcare. But Internet of Things, of course, is used for many other things, like my parcel that I'm sending to you with some courier. I want to track that parcel. that also is pervasive sensing, but not used for healthcare, unless there's medicines in there, maybe. And so the Internet of Things contains a lot of sensors. Most of those sensors are not medical at all. But on the other hand, you're surprised on the air quality in your neighborhood might be a medical sensor after all, because it might affect a whole group of population there. So never before in known history of mankind, we are having so much sensors that are collecting so much data, usually wireless or networked at least, so they can be collected centrally. The trouble is not lack of information. The trouble now becomes making sense of sensing. Some relevant use cases, well, coming back to the nephrology part, in 2017 we published an open access systematic review on whether wearable sensors can benefit patients with chronic kidney disease at all. And, well, we didn't name it pervasive sensing at that moment, but we foresaw that wearable sensors indeed could benefit CKD patients in connection with cardiovascular disease, chronic heart failure, COPD-related parameters, of course diabetes, clearly, huge, and fitness and frailty-related parameters sensed by wearable devices. We think those all could indeed benefit chronic kidney disease patients.
I just have to think back when you and I met for the first time in a restaurant over lunch, and I believe you had 3 watches on your or devices on your arm that would sense all sorts of different things like oxygen saturation, heart rate, mobility, and so on. So is there a sort of priority you would give to certain signals? I mean, now that people have Apple Watches and Fitbits and many other devices.
Yes, well, in fact, that review that we published then already looked upon which parameters would make sense to measure and which ones would be also doable. Of course, that's already a few years ago, but I think that still pretty much holds. So blood pressure, preferably cuffless blood pressure measurement, which is of course difficult, but now is coming into reach. That is an enabler. Then ECG, of course, ECG by itself is not new, it's very, very old, but making it very, very wearable, energy efficient, and inside something that you carry along all the time anyhow, then it becomes interesting because you can have longitudinal data, either continuous ECG, which is a little bit difficult because then you would need a device like a patch or so, but sometimes intermittent ECGs are also already giving a lot of things away. One of the examples is a person I know that uses its Apple Watch to have this uncanny feeling with oh, my heart, it's not good, and recording some episodes where the cardiologist can at least grossly determine what kind of problems there are. In this case, it were PVCs. So it helps to collect data. I think a very big one will be fluid overload and body composition. That will be a new one, although we know that there's bedside equipment now for bioimpedance spectroscopy that can monitor things like that on the bedside, but that's a spot check. And the good news is that nowadays chips can be made very, very small and very energy efficient, that can be incorporated in wearables that can have, bioimpedance spectroscopy longitudinal, which really can help to measure, fluid overload and body composition. We are also publishing recently. We have a great PhD working on this, and Melanie Schoutetten, and she has published already that wearable bioimpedance spectroscopy is doable in dialysis patients. Of course, then blood glucose. Well, there's a lot of work going on blood glucose measurements, and we see that also not only sensing, but continuously sensing, but also closed loop control is now really becoming into reach. We are seeing not only insulin, but also even insulin and glucagon injection possibilities, so that you can have both of these drugs being injected, and closed loop control is getting better and better on this. So that is really an area that's booming. where, of course, people that want to avoid kidney disease can have a lot of profit from. And patients on dialysis or patients with kidney disease may have relatively often diabetes, and that helps to at least slow down the progression of your kidney disease, as far as I know. I'm not a medical doctor, by the way. We have to be sure about that. I'm just a technologist. Then, of course, physical activity. That is also both in the monitoring way, to measure physical activity, like the step counters and calorie burning measurements, but also the stimulation of nudging people to know, wouldn't you just get up and walk a bit, or would you take a break? That kind of stuff, that is also coming now with wearables. Then the last one that was identified in that review of 2017, very systematic review, by the way, was anemia. We thought it was interesting, but only if it would be very cheap and simple, as, for instance, a byproduct of SpO2 sensing, or as hematocrit measurements during hemodialysis anyway. And I forgot to mention, PPG, the photoplethysmography, and SpO2, the measurement of oxygen in the blood, optically by using light, those are already inside many wearables and mobile phones, and they have their applications. For instance, the detection of atrial fibrillation is nowadays doable from basically any mobile phone by using a web subscription. It's called FibriCheck, and it's been validated by the FDA. So that is new. These kinds of probing measurements that are not so obtrusive and can be kept in your mobile phone or a simple wearable, that can help to detect early these kinds of problems.
So this is actually really interesting. I mean, when you think about it, the opportunities to gather data, and I recently came across a paper that would describe sensors that are built into walls. So for example, that can be used also for movement and others. I mean, how do you discuss with someone who might say, oh gosh, I actually don't want to give all my data away. I have real privacy concerns here. I'm concerned that things may get hacked. I have concerned, speaking of closed loop insulin pumps, that the pump gets hacked and the wrong dose of insulin gets injected. I mean, there is papers out there on this. How do you have a conversation with with these people like who have concerns, and so I guess at the end of the day it's the balance between what can you get out of it and what have you give for it, right? Or how do you see that?
No, that's totally true, and those concerns are certainly real. I mean, people should be worried about their privacy. Apart from medical sensing, apart from nephrology, just the cameras that we are using and the microphones that we are using on our laptops and phones and whatever, we know that even presidents of countries can be just tapped via their mobile phones by other countries. We've read it in the newspapers, it's happening. So privacy is probably one of the very, very most scarce things in the world in the end. That is totally true. Nevertheless, there's also a lot of opportunities. So let me start with the threats. Security breaches in data access and security breaches in control of a device, those are the real nightmares. You don't want those to happen. That means that you have to make extremely good keys on this. And one thing that you don't want keys to have as a property is that they're easily being reproduced. So software clonable keys are the nightmare, because those are really, once cracked, they can be spread everywhere. And you can believe me, there's a lot of malware which exists that you can use. You drive your car by to any home and you run that software for 2 minutes and you know exactly how to get in the network of that place, even if it's a reasonably good network. So security breaches in data access and device control, those are the biggest hurdle. And there are hardware solutions on that, like, for instance, physically unclonable features. Best way to explain that is any chip has a certain hardware signature, which is determined by the hardware. And if you send in a certain ping, a certain code or a certain command, you will get a unique signature back. It's like in the movies, the typewriter that was used to type the threatening letter, the blackmail letter. Every typewriter, no matter if they're made in the same factory and they have serial numbers that are following each other, still every typewriter has a little bit of minimal mechanical differences with the other one. And that is the signature. And that police used to use that to identify, no, this letter indeed has been written on this typewriter, or this bullet has been fired by this gun. We know that. So in chips, you have the same kind of hardware signature, and you cannot clone it by software. And that is one, I think, very promising area. Of course, we also have blockchain, all these technologies, and if you combine them, it's even getting better. But you have to make sure that this is well regulated, that this is not getting into the wrong hands. That is going to be, not only for medical, but for the whole world, also for the financial world, is going to be the cornerstone of security. During the COVID crisis, I haven't paid anything cash for 1.5 years. I only used my electronic chip. So I'd like to have that security also not breached. So those problems are the same.
Yeah. So I mean, the good thing is that there are so many other areas or domains of our life where cybersecurity is getting more and more and more relevant, be it the finance sector, as you just said, but also just Internet of Things, the personal, the electronic assistants, etc., etc. So I think it's something where healthcare, in my mind, has to be at the forefront, because what data are more intimate than information about your body, your health? So I think it will take quite some in-depth conversations on a societal level. What kind of data should people be mandated to share if they have a certain illness, for example? Or what is their opt-in, opt-out versions? So I think this is an area where currently, of course, a lot of discussion is going on, but I think there, in my mind at least, there are still many open questions.
Oh yes, and it's also a race. It's like counterfeit money. There's always a race between the characteristics of realness, the technologies to make that, and the counterfeiters that are trying to imitate that. There's always a race between those two, and that race still also will be between the people that try to keep security intact and the ones that try to breach it.
So Fokko, actually, where do you see the future directions of pervasive sensing in healthcare in general, but also specifically in kidney medicine, in nephrology?
I think the good news for any healthcare, but also for nephrology, is longitudinal data throughout daily life. Although even for patients that are, for instance, doing dialysis in center, most of the time they're not in center, fortunately for them. So even if you have people coming in 3 times a week in the center, still most of the time they're not in. And the things that are interesting sometimes happen, or likely also happen, outside of the clinic. If you have longitudinal data throughout your daily life, you are recognizing patterns. Also, for instance, the typical white coat effect that we all know from blood pressure measurements, and the simple spot check blood pressure measurement by the physician. There's a lot of people that have the white coat effect. Somehow they have a false high blood pressure, or a false normal or false low blood pressure. when they see a white coat. I don't know why, but it is really there. And if you measure a parameter like blood pressure in daily life, you can avoid that, and you can find the real cases, and also whether your treatment is working or not, and whether you have to fine-tune it. It's also for stimulating self-management. While you keep an eye on the outcomes, that would be good. I think that there's a lot of patients that could have more self-management, could handle that, especially the younger ones. Now we see people of 80 years that's using internet and installing new software and apps and whatever. My mother-in-law is 82, and she taught me how to install an app last week. Okay, so we are seeing that people may become more self-management-like, but it's good if you also can keep an eye as the doctor on that. Now, for COVID, home dialysis typically would be stimulated if you know that your parameters and the meaningful events are being measured and being seen by your physician, but you can do your treatments at home. That is a real benefit, not just for your agenda and the way that you live, the way you plan your life, that we knew. But COVID taught us a forgotten benefit, namely self-isolation. If you want to isolate yourself from the possibility to get contaminated, staying at home is great, but not if you're on in-center dialysis. How would you stay home? You're going to die, so you have to go. And this is probably a factor that none of us 2 years ago was calculating in that much, but it appears now to be an interesting one and a very solid one. And as you just mentioned, also the data. So data ownership is going to be interesting. Who owns my data as a patient? Do I own that data? Does my doctor own that data? But then I have maybe a cardiologist and a nephrologist. I have a GP. Who owns it? So that's going to be an interesting question, and probably the responsibility chain on that data has to be looked at very well. But I can imagine that patients will have a lot to say about their data ownership. Also, telling about one of the threats. You may have seen the movie Apollo 13, where the crew, Jim Lovell just ripped off his electrodes. He was monitored all the time, and he got remarks on that, and he said, I don't want those remarks. I have to have my head on what I'm doing, and I don't want people looking over my shoulders and breathing in my neck. It's a bit counterintuitive, because from a professional point of view, and I think that we all agree that astronauts are being heavily professional people, but still they're people. So that's an interesting sign about the uncanny feeling that on being observed, this can be sometimes too much. And if us astronauts as highly professional people can have that, then we all can have that. Going to the advantages, I think that recently, and it's a very good principle, the FAIR principles for data ownership and data hosting have been formulated quite well. I've included a link in, if you can include it in the PDF would be great. Namely, FAIR stands for findable, accessible, and I think personally also that aids should also be anonymously accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And it's a very interesting concept where the data doesn't move. It stays secure where it was, and it doesn't go to another disk or another storage facility. The query that is used to search that data is accepted. It has to fulfill a number of prerequisites, and if it fulfills the prerequisites, it's allowed to go into the database, do the query, collect the outcome, but do not take any IDs, not any identity characteristics, and then go back with the answers. So that is an interesting one, because the outcome of the query goes back, but anonymously. Still valid, but anonymously, and the data stays where it is in a safe place. Interesting concept. Then, of course, what we want to avoid is the possible misuse, not only a security breach of people that get into data that are not allowed to get the data, but also the other one, people that are allowed to go to the data, but they might misuse their monopoly position. Suppose that you're a big firm, you have a huge network, and you are getting all the data from your equipment and you put it in your database, and then you say, that's mine. And if a patient goes to another provider, or just moves to another country with another organization, which can be done, and then you say, no, you cannot take your data with you, it's mine. Could be happening. And that, of course, is not good. And because, yes, you have all the rights to use that data because you're treating that patient, but if the patient, for instance, moves to another country, it would be good in the interest of the patient that other historical data would be accessible. Things like that should also be somehow regulated. And then we come to one of the most, so apart from the security, the nightmare of any doctor is the 3Ds, namely doctors drowning in data. That is a nightmare. You don't want to have that. What the doctors want, as far as they told me, and I've been talking to quite a lot of them, is that there's a distillation of meaningful events. Preferably, it probably will be done with artificial intelligence, to get not a huge amount of data, but only the events that make sense. To say, wait a minute, something fishy here, something's changing. I just give you an example. My mother was saved. Her life literally was saved by the neighbor that drove by in the car and said, hey, Mrs. Wieringa still has the curtains closed. Normally she's up this time. And when she got back from the village with the groceries, hey, curtains are still closed. That's not normal. Normally she's really up this time. I'm going to take a look. And so that is this was not artificial intelligence, that was real intelligence. But the pattern is deviating from its normal thing. This is weird. Let me take a look. And that is the moment that as a physician, you want to be pulled on your sleeve and say, wait a minute, something's wrong. This is not the normal pattern. This patient is normally stable. Something's happening with the potassium. And that is the moment that you want to be giving attention, but you don't want to see kilometers of ECG. Remember the first Holters, that those poor cardiologists had to go through literally kilometers of ECG registration to look for abnormalities. That is, of course, crazy. So it pretty soon became that their software was recognizing weird events. Say, hey, this is a weird beat. Take a look at it. And it's much better. Sorry that I'm taking so much time.
No. I mean, this is really interesting, and I have to say it certainly widens my perspective on the topic. Now, some in our audience may ask themselves, what pervasive sensing technologies have already made a real difference to patients' health or to general population's health? Can you point us maybe to one or two examples where you think that pervasive sensing technologies have really improved the life of patients?
For me personally, it is the physical activity stuff that is helping me to be reminded about, take more exercise. I do think that, but it depends. But blood pressure, simply just taking blood pressure in the morning and in the evening already helps a lot. And the availability of the simple devices that we all now know, even with the cuffs, already brought a big difference. There was a time when these devices were simply not available, and you simply had to go to a doctor for your blood pressure to be measured. Those days are gone, and keeping track of your blood pressure literally might, save, but at least prolong your life quite a bit. Blood pressure is something that is really silent. So I do think that it may be an old one, but it's an oldie but a goldie one. But that's my I'm not a medical doctor. I think you have better ideas on that.
No, I was just thinking like blood glucose measurements
blood glucose,
especially
sure.
in type 1 diabetics. This is, I mean, although this is not pervasive sensing, I would think it's more point of care testing, but it might fall under a wider definition of sensing that's brought to the patient's home. And I think that's this might be another one. Yeah, I mean, just to wrap this up, a final just question, or what in your mind is the next big thing in this area? Is it something like the confluence of, say, pervasive sensing with AI? Is it certain pervasive sensing technologies? Is it in the area of connecting pervasive sensing data elements, say, with other data sources, be it weather data, be it mobility data, etc., etc.? Just maybe in 2 or 3 sentences. I know it's a difficult question worth a whole lecture, but just to the point. What do you think is the next big thing here?
Well, definitely the pattern recognition in many parameters. That definitely will become interesting. And if we quickly try to focus on nephrology then, because that's the purpose of this interview, I think that, for instance, peritoneal dialysis might relatively strongly profit from this stuff, because so far that was considered more or less a low-tech dialysis technology. But recently we've seen sensors now that are easy applicable and that can monitor and very precisely judge the dialysate that you're entering into the belly and the effluent which comes after the treatment out. That alone, or for instance, with a mobile phone, have a picture of the entrance site of your catheter and the redness judged by machine learning. So those things alone can have a huge impact on being early with detection of infection. And that makes a hell of a lot of difference. I think that really is making a difference, of course, in hemodialysis also, but I wanted to point out also the more low-tech considered treatments can profit hugely from this. Miniaturization, overall, definitely. That's going to be a big thing, but we should not forget miniaturization is one thing, but power efficiency, that is crucial. You hate to charge your phone halfway the day. You hate to charge your watch halfway the day. That doesn't work. You're okay with it, putting it on the night table, but energy efficiency to at least cover a whole 24 hours, that really is a very crucial point, because otherwise people get annoyed and stuff ends in the sock drawer. Still, I think data security and privacy are the biggest things. Getting good keys on that is really crucial. I think also tiny artificial intelligence. Remember that the chess program that won from the world champion in chess was on a big mainframe. It was the edge of what was possible at that moment, and it won from a human. But nowadays, we can put tiny artificial intelligence on a quarter of my pinky nail. And I think we need that, because for really meaningful medical devices, you don't want to be dependent on your quality of your internet connection. You want to have a local intelligence that can do the most important decisions right away.
This is actually so interesting to see your perspective. I mean, as I said, you're an engineer with decades of experience in the field. You publish in it, you conduct active research, you have intellectual property in this area. So you certainly have more insight, certainly than I do, and I guess some of our audience too. So Fokko, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure having you on this series. I'm sure it won't be our last conversation. Maybe we revisit this topic again in a few years from now. But really, thank you. It was a terrific pleasure having you.
The pleasure was fully mutual, Peter. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for joining the Renal Research Institute for this episode of Frontiers in Kidney Medicine and Biology. We invite you to engage with us on our social media channels and look forward to seeing you again soon for the next episode of Frontiers in Kidney Medicine and Biology.